Like to just quickly introduce the topic and then we'll start formally.
Okay, well, the topic with the title there, 2 field studies of the sense of being stared at, and it was put together by 4 people, Ellie and Ben. They were my dissertation students, and then Matthew Coburn has also joined forces with us to take the study forward, because we will be eventually publishing the work that we're doing here, but presenting it initially at the SPR conference gives us a platform and a chance to get some useful feedback, especially when it comes to the methods that we use in the data. So that's what it's about.
Field studies. Wow, I just saw that word field, and that is what's really shocked me, because in my day, all of our studies in remote staring were in the lab with timed randomization for when you stared and when you didn't. So this is something very different, very new, and very exciting. And I'm guessing by the fact you're reporting, we're going to hear some positive results, but let's wait and see. Okay.
Surprise.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Kel.
Thank you, CJ. So I've talked about the title. So the first 3 authors, we are based at the University of Northampton. Ellie and Ben are just graduating right now with their undergraduate degrees. And Matt Coburn, even though we've got him supervising with us, he's on a PhD involving past life memories and reincarnation. He also lectures and supervises studies at the Aleph Trust, where they've got a master's degree in spirituality, consciousness studies, and transpersonal psychology as well. So who's who? This is who we are. And look, there's a picture of me from when we had the ASSAP conference at the University of Bath. I tootled down to the ancient Roman baths, which I never miss the chance every time I'm in the city of Bath, which I'm absolutely in love with, to go around the ancient Roman baths. I've been doing that ever since I was a child, and I had a very quick run around the whole place and went and just sat by the main pool for a while. So I took a picture there, but that's me. You're familiar with me. If you've never met Matt, there he is on the far right, the Aleph Trust. He's got a new book coming out that regards various elements of parapsychology, but he has done one in the past called Pluralism in the Mind, which has a particular chapter involving parapsychology, which is a very good book to get hold of. He's also done short stories as well. So if you check out his book called City in the Dust, that is a really nice book of short stories. I think it's Cities in the Dust. Cities in the Dust. Look up his name, you'll find the book. And there's a nice picture there of Ellie and Ben, who were both doing independent studies on this. They went away and collected their own data, but with the same method, and then we brought them together. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And when we were at the SPR this weekend just gone, Ellie came along and presented some of this with me, which was really nice to see an undergraduate student immediately going to a conference, networking, seeing what it's about, and having that opportunity to talk about the work they've done and why they see it as important and what we can learn from it. So we've had the title, The Sense of Being Stared At. So let's learn a little bit more about what this phenomena is all about. Well, it's also known as scopaesthesia, more commonly known as the sense of being stared at. It's the purported ability of one being able to sense when another in the local environment is staring at the back of one's head or the back of the body in general without the aid of any known sensory cues, especially visual stimuli to detect the stare, i.e. cues in the peripheral vision. So it can't be here, and it can't be at the sides here, peripheral vision that we talk about, where you sat on the sofa and you suddenly see on the carpet a spider runs out, or the cat's walking by and it catches your eye, and you turn. Even in apparition cases where you say, I saw something at the corner of my eye, it can't be that. It can't be within the field of your vision. So we can't have that 180 degrees. It has to be behind you. And so it's all about your body, the back of your head, the back of your body, detecting that something isn't right and not necessarily thinking someone is staring at me, though that could occur. If I was actually before you right now and you were all sat in an audience and I said, how many of you could relate to this? And you put your hands up. On average, I tend to see about 55 to 70% of people putting their hands up in a small audience. So it's a very common phenomenon that many people can relate to. So this could also include knowing the direction from where the stare is coming from. So we will talk a little bit more in a second. That's one of the comments from Rupert Sheldrake. And he's also recently, as you can see there, Sheldrake and Pam Smart, 2023, They have a most recent paper in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which is open access, regarding a new study demonstrating people's ability to accurately detect the direction from which the stare is coming from. Scopisthesia is the scientific term for this phenomena, deriving from the Greek words for looking and knowing. It has also been referred to as remote staring detection, to detach from the idea of a sensory process which staring detection might not involve, where a feeling of being stared at may be more appropriate due to reports of physiological cues before recognition of that stare. So you feel a bit uncomfortable, you sat in a library, you sat in a canteen, you sat on a bench in a park, and you're just a bit fidgety. You're not even necessarily conscious that you're fidgety, but you just feel the need to just stop what you're doing. You're eating a sandwich, you're reading a book, and just have a look around your environment. And lo and behold, someone behind you, maybe at a distance, is staring at you. So you get that recognition of the actual stare afterwards. The act of then turning around to acknowledge the stare can be a conscious or unconscious process, but certainly demonstrates a need to scan one's surroundings when in some public place or open surrounding. And so in 1994, in some of the earlier books by Rupert Sheldrake, and all of his books have been very, very popular. I do encourage any of you that have never read anything by Rupert to get hold of one of these books. But there's various overlaps where he never makes the assumption that his audience have bought all of his books. So a lot of his books can tell you things that are in some of his later books. So one of his first books to mention the sense of being stared at is 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. And within one of those 7 suggested studies is remote staring detection, scopisthesia, and gives you some sort of how-to as to setting up your own studies for this, looking into it, or why it's ultimately important, why it could change the world. It'd tell us a lot more about nonverbal communication. It would tell us a lot more about human consciousness and also potential psi aspects, that ability to detect something between 2 people that's not involved any physical process. It's a non-physical process, it's non-material. So it's very much like a psychokinetic phenomenon. You're staring at the back of someone's head or body, and there is a physiological reaction to that stare. You've influenced their body. So I would argue it's not really a telepathic thing, because this tends to be with strangers, and you don't have telepathic experiences with people you don't know. This is more of an invasion of your space, and knowing that someone is staring or glaring at you, that causes that disruption and that need to protect yourself and look at your surroundings. So later on, he had a book completely dedicated to this phenomena, where he'd done many more studies and put them together. So he had a lot more to talk about, especially with regards to early field studies and surveys that he'd done in the sense of being stared at and other unexplained powers of the human mind. So do check that out. That came out in 2003, and there's been numerous reprints of that book since then. What's Rupert got to say about this? Well, most people surveyed say they've had the felt experience of someone looking at them from behind, which is immediately confirmed when they turn around. Most have also had the converse experience, staring at someone in a crowd who then turns around to look back. Since the late 1980s, I've been researching this sense of being stared at, formerly termed scopisthesia, which has wide implications for the nature of our minds, our vision, and the world at large. He even said in some of his early studies on this and presentations of the sense of being stared at, that it's interesting how humanity and science views vision. When you look at early physics textbooks and biology textbooks on how vision works, it's very much like Superman with the laser vision, in that when it's demonstrating how the human head with the eyes in the head look at something, they always put dotted lines going from the eye to the object, and then the whole process of the lens working and photons bouncing back to the eye to deliver the vision, as though something is leaving the eye to pick up the image we're looking at and return it. And of course, as far as we know of human psychology and the physiology of the eye, that's not how it works. Nothing, as far as we know in that sense, leaves the eye. But it's interesting that science and some of those early textbooks were actually presenting the idea, well, maybe something does actually leave the eye to pick up on what it needs to actually receive information back on. And that very much makes us think about the sense of being stared at, that when we are staring at someone, if they are picking up on a stare, is something actually leaving that field of vision to bounce back from that person? So what is it for? if it genuinely is a phenomenon and it's out there and it's an interesting process that we have the ability to use, either to stare at someone and influence them or detect when someone is staring at us, what's it for? Well, if we think of it in an evolutionary sense, it could be due to threat detection. So there we have Richard Broughton up there. And I think that lady right now, she knows something. She's on the walk, look, but someone is potentially staring at her. There he is. She's aware. And Richard has said, if you want to know how it works, first find out what it's for. That was a really interesting presentation he gave to the Parapsychological Association. I think it was in 1987, and research in parapsychology would always be presented a year later. So that was published in 1988. And it's off the back of Richard having spoken to an engineer about his work in parapsychology. And the engineer said, if you want to know how it works, first find out what it's for. That was the very basic principle of how engineers would look at machines. What's it for? That will tell you more about, how it works. And with this, it's a threat detection, essentially, a basic evolutionary need to assess potential dangers within our surroundings, such as predator-prey relationships. Many of us could probably relate to having watched nature documentaries where the gazelle is happily chomping away at some grass, and it suddenly stops chomping away and it looks up, looks left, looks right, as though it's surveying its surroundings. But why is he doing that? And we, as the watchers of this documentary, know that the documentary filmmakers are perfectly aware of that lioness in the long grass who is right down, steadily creeping towards this gazelle. And the gazelle is aware of something. It's surveying its surroundings. Can it sense that there is some sort of immediate danger, and that's why it's had to look up and have a look around? And does that relate to humans as well? Is that why we have a look around when something like that is going on, when someone within that crowd is staring at the back of us? If you're interested more in that evolutionary perspective, you could go to Richard Broughton's paper from 1988. He also has a chapter from 2015 in a textbook called Parapsychology, a Handbook for the 21st Century on Biology and Psi, in which he mentions for this evolutionary basis. And Louis Sava, Dr. Louis Sava, who some of you might be aware of, he was involved in some early episodes of Most Haunted and I'm Famous and Frightened. His PhD involved looking at an evolutionary basis for precognition. So that would be something interesting to turn to. PhDs, by the way, in the UK are open access. So once they're out there, if you go on Google Scholar and look at those people's names, you're able to obtain them and read through them. So what were some of the general findings of Rupert Sheldrake? Well, in his survey, 70 to 90% of people surveyed between Europe and the USA reported to have had experienced the sense of being stared at. Presented such findings, discussions of early research back to the very late 1800s in which some of this research started and writings on this phenomenon, and preliminary field-based designs, which then translated into extensive laboratory-based work in the late 1980s to the present day. When it comes to his field-based research, this included interviewing people in positions where staring and watching people was part of their professional skill set. That this could be anything from detectives or private detectives when they're asked to track someone or follow them, going down the street, staring at the back of the person's head and then getting out the way. They told Rupert that in many of these cases, if you know you've got to track someone down or stare at them, staring at the back of their head or watching them when doing so was the worst thing you could do. You had to try and go in their direction where you knew they were walking, but keep out of the way. Because from their experience, if you stared at them as you were doing this, they would stop and turn around and survey their surroundings as though they knew they were being tracked. They knew they were being followed. In other cases, it would be people in supermarkets. I'm sure many of you are aware when you go through, there's often a security guard by the main doors watching a big monitor of all the CCTV in the supermarket. Speaking to some of these people, they will know instances where someone is stood by a shelf and they take something off it and put it inside their coat. And then the security guards have noted they'll stay there for a minute and then go, oh, and put it back on the shelf again, as though they realize that now is not your opportunity to steal something. You are being watched. They might not consciously think that, but something didn't feel right. And it's because over CCTV, someone is staring at you. Someone is watching you in that act. And so it can work on CCTV as well. Distance is not a problem, as was found with early research with Joseph Banks Rhine and Louisa Rhine at Duke University. They'd tested people just opposite each other on the table, through to the next room, through to the next building, through to the other side of campus. Psi studies didn't really seem to be hindered in any way by distance and separation of sender and receiver. Oh, and on that last point, also demonstrations in the media. Rupert was on a television program where there were a number of people, I think, going to see a theatre performance. And as they went up this stairway to the theatre, behind the staircase, so that the stairs are going up, and at the bottom of the stairs, just as you turn that corner to go up the stairs, they got a two-way mirror. And Rupert was behind there with a camera crew and some other people, staring at people to see how they would react. And they did indeed get some people that were in the motion of going up the stairs, but would actually stop for a moment to look back and stare at the mirror as though they felt something wasn't quite right. And indeed, someone on the other side of the mirror was staring at them. For our dissertation students, back when we had Park Campus at the University of Northampton, it doesn't exist anymore. That campus was all knocked down and changed for housing, and we moved to Waterside. But when we were there, we had a lab facility that included a two-way mirror and CCTV, and many students had used it for this. We have got a similar system at Waterside, but it had been a popular study to try out for many, many years. So the results of Sheldrake's work have presented highly significant results suggestive of potential psi processes at work and challenge materialist paradigms. Even though such studies employ experimental control and exploration potential psi processes, they lack ecological validity. So what do we mean by ecological validity? We mean real-world applications. We've taken something that happens in the real world and we've stuck it in the lab, and we've told a person, right, we're going to stare at you or not 100 times. Every time you hear the bell ring, tell us whether you think someone is or isn't staring at you. How does that apply to the real world? That never happens. In the real world, no one tells you they're going to stare at you a number of times and tell us whether you are or aren't being stared at. And so this has ecological validity when we move to the field studies. You're going to the very place where people report these things, and you're just watching and observing. Ecological validity. So I'll give you a little snapshot demonstration of Rupert doing some of these early studies, lab-based type studies, where he's gone to an average school. Let's just call this one Eton, because it is. And he's got loads of these schoolboys in one room demonstrating how you will go about testing this. I'll just move it along to the right. I can just get that far, I think. 22, okay. Just before.
To buy enough coats. So now I'm going to do the click, and now I'm gazing at the back of your neck. Yes, so that's right. And I then say right, and I score it. But I'll get out of the way now, and I won't be watching.
Look. Not looking. From your looking. Yeah. Not looking. Not looking. No, it's not looking. Not looking. Not looking. Looking.
So now what we want to do is change over so the person who's doing the looking is now looked at. So we're staying with the same partners, just switching over.
Looking. Looking. Not looking. You're looking. Not looking. You're not looking. I was looking. Looking. Not looking. No, yeah, I'm looking. I wasn't.
Okay?
Yeah. Wrong. Not looking.
That's right.
Well, this looks interesting. May we take part?
Yes.
The philosophy class next door wondered what the commotion was and was invited in to participate in a group stare.
Looking.
Correct.
Not looking.
Correct.
Dr. Sheldrake tallied the results of this day's experimentation, and when added to previous statistics, the odds against it occurring by chance in thousands of trials are over 10 billion to 1.
So as you can see, many of these lab-based trials, when they're doing many runs, we've got 7,794. Then it's going way beyond the mean chance expectancy, which is that correct trials there, whether they're correct that someone is staring at them or the correct that someone isn't staring at them. So that's against the opposite, where you say absolutely opposite. Someone is staring at you, and you say they aren't, or someone isn't staring at you and say that they are. And so you only got 4 possible outcomes. And these lab studies have been done again and again and again. Rupert's got a massive database of these, and there's been many replications as well. Oh, sorry, that's just put on to the next. Yeah, we need the next slide. So after that, there were a lot of criticisms that started to come up. So that first book, 7 Experiments to Change the World, came out in 1994. Baker then did a study in the Skeptical Inquirer, which also encouraged a lot of discussion. There were some further articles on this. I think Rupert had certainly said something in response, but there were several letters to editor of that magazine in which people commented on their thoughts about the sense of being stared at. So that created some initial dialogue. It also sparked my interest in this early on. And the Journal of Consciousness Studies as well had a special issue called Sheldrake and His Critics, The Sense of Being Glared At, in which Rupert was allowed to give 2 introductory notes. And then there were a number of people that gave responses to what they thought about the work so far on the sense of being stared at, including people like Sue Blackmore, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I was only talking about her autobiography yesterday with some colleagues at work, which is called In Search of the Light, A Parapsychologist's Adventure. I do encourage you to read that. It's a very interesting autobiography about her career in parapsychology. So anyway, she contributed with others about what they thought about this, and it is very critical of the phenomena and what they think about the data so far. And then Rupert has the final word in that as well. But really great that it's gone into the Journal of Consciousness Studies. I believe there's been at least a couple of things of equal interest to the Journal of Consciousness Studies since then on staring detection. I certainly know Rupert has done a fairly recent controversial but certainly thought-provoking article for JCS, which was regarding whether the sun, as in the sun in our solar system, is conscious or not, which was an interesting read. So when I was an undergraduate, my final year project with Professor Chris Rowe supervising was staring detection because of Rupert's book and because of Robert Baker's study in the Skeptical Inquirer and because of that special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies that had just come out. And so I did that. And then many years later, as you can see from this date, over 10 years later, I decided to just bring together all the field studies that I knew of, which are only 3 to date, and talk about the ecological approaches and validity for staring detection. So I published that in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology under the title Ecological Approaches to Scopaesthesia, in which I reviewed all 3 studies and then gave my thoughts and ideas for how you would take this forward. So let me go back. Let me tell you what Robert Baker did and what the other 2 field studies did. Well, it's a very interesting read, Robert's article, because you start to realize this skeptical approach that he has initially when he goes in. Before he's even started the study, he says people who are cognitively focused, i.e. mentally engrossed in activity, will never, under normal circumstances, attend to such a weak, non-intrusive, non-material competing sensation as that of being stared at. Showing that people are not aware they're being stared at is a demonstration of common sense, not an experiment with an unpredictable outcome. In his study, it was 2 parts, part field study, part lab study. With the field study, 40 people were stared at in the library and then approached and asked if they thought they were being stared at and filled in a response form. 2 of those people felt they were often being watched or able to notice this feeling. And so Baker took these 2 participants forward and did a little bit more testing on them to see, well, if they genuinely can sense when someone is staring at them, can they accurately perceive the direction from which the stare is coming from? And they couldn't. So as far as Baker was concerned, he discarded these 2 people for being paranoid and said they were no longer part of his data collection. 3 people reported something was wrong or odd, and during the time that they were stared at, they had stood up and they had looked around and they'd shifted positions several times. And then for the remaining 35, they felt nothing during that time. So Robert Baker felt pretty satisfied that he found evidence for what he went in looking for, which was nothing. Seems a bit odd, doesn't it? I mean, that for me is not appropriate skepticism or skeptical inquiry, or even good rapport with your participants either, or handling data appropriately. There are so many problems with this. I think this particular paper or article is really good for students and just general discussion in terms of, if you read this, what concerns do you have about how the researchers has handled this and how you can make this study better? So one of his final comments was, unless replication of these two studies prove otherwise, it is prudent to conclude that people cannot tell when they are being stared at. If experimental pursuits question either the validity or reliability of the outcome of these two demonstrations, I suggest they repeat them and see for themselves. If people somehow know they are being stared at, but only at a sub-threshold level, which at the moment is unproven and only speculative, this fact is of theoretical value only and is far too weak and unreliable to be of any practical use to modern man. So there we go. So what did I do in my studies? Well, I had two chances at this. We did an initial study and I collected the data between Northampton and Mansfield. So I know there's some distance apart. I live up in the Mansfield area, Nottinghamshire, and the rest were done in Northampton because of the University of Northampton and studying and now working there. So the first study that I conducted was in 2008, and it was in the summertime. And it was with covert filming, so I had a camera next to me, and I would film the people that I was staring at. I'd flip a coin as to whether for the first 30 seconds I would stare at them, if it's heads, or not stare at them, if it was tails, and then alternate. So there was a staring and non-staring condition, and I would write down who the person was. So in terms of, oh, they're wearing a red coat, they're window shopping, or like you can see in that first picture, there's a lady sat there under, forgotten what those are called. It's the thing that you put a shoe on when you're mending shoes, because it's Hampton. But she's sat there probably having a sandwich or something. So if you stare at the back of her head, how does she react? And it was weighed up from that. And there was no independent judge. This was me reviewing the overall outcomes and then submitting it to a chi-square to look at these four potential outcomes. And it was significant. But we took this forward for my full dissertation study, and we wanted an independent judge involved. And we also wanted to just improve the methods in general, really. We introduced a fidgeting scale. So not only was it on, did they turn around and look in your direction, but how much did they move during that time as well? Just look like with the Baker study, where he said they stood up and they moved position during that time as though they're being influenced by the stare. The problem with the second study was going out into these same places. Look at that. People are wandering about and it's sunny and it's nice. In the winter time, which was the only time I had available to get the dissertation completed, it was snowing and it was wet and it was cold, and it was so difficult to get 100 people to stand still long enough and film them to have an appropriate trial. And that footage went to Chris Rowe. He was the independent judge. He reviewed the footage, the staring, the no staring conditions. We only identified about 10 people that seemed to have potentially reacted. So then that's when we applied this fidgeting scale, where 0, there was no obvious reaction, to 5, there's full on turn around and stare back in the direction of the camera. How many people have, to see if there was any significance within that 10? And there wasn't. So that first study was a positive one, but the methods, I would argue, were weak because there weren't many safeguards in place. And then the second one, we improved on the safeguards. There was no evidence in that study for staring detection occurring, but the weather conditions were naff. And I think that also put people off being there long enough to be aware of a stare. They wanted to get inside. They wanted to be dry and warm. They wanted to get out of the way of the weather. So that's where that took off. After that, we have Ross Friday. There he is. Look, he's clearly noticed that I'm staring at him, or that you're all staring at him online. He was supervised by Dr. David Luke at the University of Greenwich. He also explored within his PhD study acoustic aesthesia, which is the sense of being heard. So people are having a discussion about you the other side of the room, and you're aware of this, even though you're not necessarily in earshot of that those particular acoustics. They're not actually coming to you, but you're aware it's something to do with you, or of being heard by other people as well. So I took this quote from his SPR talk. He's done 3 to 4 SPR talks of this PhD study over time. And I went back and listened to them, and particularly this part where he got to the third phase of his PhD, the third study, which was going to include a field study. So I naturally had a few discussions with him before he got to this point. This was the part we were most excited about. It was the most ecologically valid, but it was the most difficult to set up ethics-wise, because with this, we couldn't get them into the lab. We didn't have the safety of the lab condition. We also couldn't get their permission for what we were doing before it actually took place. Effectively, we had to follow people, watch people, and then afterwards go and ask them whether they felt that they were being watched or listened to. The benefit of my study was no participants were interacted with whatsoever. They weren't approached afterwards. They were briefly involved. They just went on their way. No one knew they'd been involved in the study, as would happen in the natural occurrence of staring detection. If it's real, you would just personally know. No one's gone up to you afterwards and said, "Did you know I was staring at you then?" That doesn't happen. But Ross was including this in his setup as well to gain some feedback. They'd initially thought about going to a nearby car parking lot near the University of Greenwich and putting up some posters saying, "Have you seen this man? He's dangerous, do not approach." So some wanted type posters to see if, as people came back from shopping and went to their car, did they feel this need to scan their surroundings? Had they subtly taken in these posters about a dangerous person on the prowl somewhere? But that was considered completely unethical as well. So the ethics committee just weren't letting that one go by. So they had to stick to campus and choose two places on campus. One, a safe place, and another one that was considered somewhere where people would be on their guard a little bit more. And so that's what took place. They had a control condition and an experimental condition, because Ross said it needed to matter. From what he found of all the previous research, like the evolutionary approach, it has to be meaningful to you as to why you need to know that someone is staring at you. So there's got to be that threat detection level. It's got to matter. It's got to be meaningful. And that's interesting. That could apply to a number of psi-based studies, even telepathy studies. Why have you had a telepathic impression from someone? What's the point? Where was it meaningful? So there were two lots of 100 people collected in the safe and non-safe spaces, two areas on campus, threat and non-threat. For the threat area, it was outside the sports facility, which little did the experimenters know at the time. So Ross and David Luke, they didn't know that a couple of assaults had actually taken place towards students on campus around that time. So some students would have been aware and extra vigilant about that particular area. They didn't know until after the study was done. And so comparing the mean chance expectancy of both the outside field conditions and both areas together, nothing was found. So they had this safe space in the middle of campus and then this threat space. The safe area produced nothing either, but for the dangerous area, significant results were found and suggested that participants were able to tell when they were and weren't being stared at in the duration of the path that they walked outside the sports facility. I'll tell you about the setup as well. Ross was inside the female changing rooms. He doesn't typically do that. Stood on a bench looking at a high-up window. So we could see the people approaching that window, which then led to a path to then access the sports facility. So I think he was on the phone or a walkie-talkie to a colleague that was at the other end of that path. So when they got to the end and turned the corner, the colleague knew who to stop and would suddenly go, "Oh, hello, can I just stop you a minute? You've just been involved in a study. Do you think just now you were being stared at or weren't being stared at?" So that's where the data was being collected and how it was being collected. So for that particular area, there was a significant effect. For the safe area, no. And for both areas combined, nothing overall. But it's interesting that that area alone, for stare and no stare detection, there was a significant effect. So Ellie and Ben, it was time for them to do their dissertations, and they came to me. Uniquely for Ellie, she hadn't done the parapsychology module in the third year, so she was completely new to parapsychology, didn't really know what to do for her dissertation. She was doing psychology and counselling, and then straight psychology. And I told them both to go to the library and get a copy of Rupert's book, The Sense of Being Stared At, and look at that special edition of the Journal of Consciousness Studies on critiques of Sheldrake's work. And then I gave them this paper that I'd done on ecological approaches to scopisthesia. And we talked about a setup on campus as to how this would work. So we could get some separate data for both their dissertations, but also let's combine them as well and see where this goes. So their aim for both their studies was to collect 100 participants each, to select a suitable place on the waterside campus for data collection, with a potential of need for people being cautious, incorporate staring and non-staring conditions, and then approach all these starees after their involvement to ask basic questions about the staring trials, and then compare the two dissertation studies. So if you haven't been to Waterside campus at the University of Northampton, this is it. This is the Learning Hub. And on the third floor to the left, that is where psychology is based, and our lab facilities, where many of those facilities are specifically catered for parapsychology. We even have our perception lab for Gansfeld research. And now, if I talk particularly about Ellie's study, so you know the setup, just because I was speaking to her recently, if you look up here where the red circle's gone, there is a balcony as well as an inside space. So her research colleague was her boyfriend, and he was up there. If it was a rainy day and the weather conditions weren't so great, he would be just inside there. But if it was a nice day, like we can see in this picture here, he'd be out on the balcony. Now, if you were up on that balcony looking down, what could you see? So the opposite of this picture is a bridge. And here it is. If you look on the far left, that's the entrance to the bridge. And then we've got the midway point. It's a very, very big, windy bridge that goes all the way over the canal system and two particular sections of the canal. And then on the far right there, that then exits into a park where you have to walk through that, and then you cross the road and you can go straight into town. Now, we decided that this does have a little bit of a threat element, because we do have security systems set up where if students feel uncomfortable, particularly in the evening, about walking through the park, then they can be escorted over there. It is dark, and I suppose it could also be quite intimidating. I think in all towns across the UK, there will be problems with certain things happening, crimes and so forth taking place in parks at night time. And so for very vulnerable or concerned students, yeah, this would be an issue. So there'd be a need to be careful and extra vigilant, and maybe walk with someone else, or tell someone, I'm just walking over the bridge now, I will meet you in 2 minutes. Make sure their friend knows that if I'm not there in 2 minutes, there's a problem. So we considered there was some sort of an element of threat and need to be vigilant. Oh, sorry, I'll just go back. So how was this set up? So he's on the roof, her boyfriend, and he's saying, right, someone's crossing the bridge now. They're wearing black trousers and a yellow coat, let's say. That's very, very specific. And so when they came off the bridge, Ellie would approach that person and say, excuse me, you've just been involved in a study. Can I ask you a couple of quick questions? Do you or don't you think you've just been stared at? And a few other things about age, what gender they identify as, and any other comments they'd like to make. What were the overall results between Ellie and Ben? Well, combined, their two studies together, there was no significant effect, which is interesting. That's very much like Ross Friday's study where he compared safe and non-safe spaces. With Ellie's study alone, there was no significant effect. But with Ben's study, there was a significant effect, and a very good one as well. However, the hit rate of the combined studies was at 55%, which is comparable to what Sheldrake has described in his own studies. So it is going in a direction that's quite desirable. So why a 55% hit rate? Why was that not significant? Well, it is likely due to the relatively small number of participants. You saw those figures Rupert was working with. They were into the thousands. This is just 200 overall. So it's a very small sample. It's around the kinds of samples that typically a dissertation student works to, just to get the idea of independent study and producing a dissertation. The effect size was not large enough with 200 trials to reject the null hypothesis. But also in one study, Chambers, there was a strong confounding bias towards people selecting not staring. So there was a lot of people that were saying no one was staring at me. What about with the males and females scores? Well, there was no statistically significant difference between the males and females staring detection in these studies separately or combined. One possible confounding variable, again, for this was, again, a strong response bias in the non-staring condition that inflated the overall outcome in both studies. Females were most accurate in Ellie's study for guessing no stare outcome. And so what can we conclude from this overall? Well, the findings contribute to the very limited number of field studies that have been carried out on the sense of being stared at. With this presentation of two dissertation studies combined, that would make 4. But we do, as a group of 4 researchers, want to take this forward a little bit more so we can get a lot more data, iron out creases of methodology, do it more formally, maybe get a bit of funding to then push this forward to a peer-reviewed paper, no matter what the outcome, because parapsychology likes significant findings and null findings. Further field studies will provide more information about such social behaviour and non-verbal communication. Some observed factors consider weather conditions, So I've mentioned this before in both my dissertation and the 2021 paper. Weather conditions do really matter. And so we need these really good conducive settings where people are lingering and dawdling because the weather's so nice. They're not in an absolute hurry to get out of the weather. Stranger danger is also important. Ellie reported there was a lot of anxiety from people that they were suddenly being approached as soon as they exited the bridge by someone saying, excuse me, you've just been involved in a study. Some people didn't want to talk to her, which is a shame. So those were lost participants. She also noticed some other issues, people using mobile phones or being in a hurry. People saying, I wasn't paying attention, I had my headphones in. Well, if the sense of being stared at is a genuine thing, it wouldn't matter whether you were paying attention or not. No one has told you you're going to be stared at or not as you walk across this bridge. It's after the fact. So if it's actually there as an actual detection, whether you had your headphones in or not, you would feel it, even if you had your headphones in listening to music. I was distracted by my phone. And then other people, sometimes I feel like I am being stared at. If I was alone, I might have felt stared at. I felt side-eyed. I think everyone has felt being stared at. And so even though the combined studies produced findings suggestive of chance, Ben's study presented results suggestive of a sight or staring effect, which is good. Therefore, with a greater number of participants, more power, as we call it, more meaningful results could be derived in extending the study. More ecological validity is provided by doing these kinds of studies than the typical lab studies. However, the self-report measures and approaching the starees, so getting them to actually rate themselves or make their decision, may lead to biased feedback, which needs to be considered. Maybe we need to go back to the kinds of study that I conducted where no one was approached and they weren't allowed to make that decision. It goes off to an independent judge looking at video footage of human reactions in these settings to see what they think. So, as I say, I adopted an independent judging approach through covertly filming trials and use of fidgeting scales to assess the footage and overcome response bias and any interaction with the staree. So that's something useful to consider. There are many more in my 2021 paper in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology. If you're personally interested in this, send me an email and I will send you a PDF copy of that so you can have a read of it because it's not open access. I think it might be on Google Scholar in an earlier format because it'd be through the University of Northampton Pure system. So you could do a Google, but I'm more than happy to email it to you if you personally want a copy. So there we go. Thank you very much for your time and thank you for listening. If you're on Twitter or X, follow me at Callum E Cooper. If you've got any questions, email me at callum.cooper2@northampton.ac.uk. And I'll come off I'll stay on the slide since it's there because I know you can still see me and CJ's there. I'll probably take a couple of quick questions from CJ and then he will facilitate the rest of the talk this evening and hopefully answer some of your other questions, but do feel free to email me as well.
Thanks very much, Kel. So, super. I love the fact that you're doing field work and I think that's really important. Why the bias, do you think, towards negative responses? And is that the same across Sheldrick's work and yours and everyone else's? I mean, is it...
I've not particularly noticed that. I do wonder when I started to find this out, especially when I was really having a good sit down with Ellie over the weekend and asking her about this. Do people think they're being tricked? And, as though they feel they're expected to say, yes, someone's staring at me because there's that potential there. So they feel like they're, it's some sort of alternative demand characteristic where they're pushing away from that demand of saying, yes, someone's staring at me and actually saying, no, nothing's going on, nothing's happening. Is it just that? Is it sort of a blasé attitude to the experiment? And I think in hindsight, with that kind of outcome to think about, that maybe you are best to avoid interaction with them after the staring. I think it's the pure observation as to how they act and react is the most important thing, which I think you need to gather feedback from those observing and the independent judges. So I think that's why filming is so good. Look at the CCTV footage examples that I gave that, there's lots of really interesting real world examples from those security guards that can see, well, someone's changed their mind on doing something they could quite easily go ahead and do. But is it because I'm staring at them? They could easily put that in their pocket and walk off. Why they just fidgeted a bit and put it back? There's no one stood with them right now, but I'm looking at them over CCTV. They don't know where that gaze is coming from. I know you're then making a big assumption as to whether they actually consciously feel that stare or not. But it is interesting that that kind of behavior is taking place and it's being observed. So I think it's this kind of a pushback against the demand characteristic, say, no, nothing's happening.
But if there is a genuine psi response, and it's going to be teleological, there's going to be a reason why. It's going to be doing something. It's going to be purposeful. So therefore, would you actually have to have a genuine threat to therefore cause the response? So if, for example, you'd asked a person just before somebody jumped out and hit them with a baseball bat, would you have got different responses? And how? I'm not sure how you could measure it, but if they believed the bridge was dangerous in some way, if the bridge was unstable, or they believed that for some reason there was a risk associated with being seen, that would be, maybe if they were playing a game, something like hide and seek, where they had to attempt to, or paintball, where they had to attempt to get from A to B without being spotted and shot at, you would then see different behavior characteristics. You'd have to introduce a real threat which was not damaging, so that you ethically didn't, end up mangling students for no reason.
Well, I've got to go back to Chris Rowe on this, because he gave a question just like yourself at the end of the SPR study. Right. Well, it's more of a statement than a question, but I don't want to name names because I can't remember exactly who it was he mentioned. I don't know if it was back in his days at the University of Edinburgh, but whoever it was, when they'd done staring detection studies, in the lab though, it wasn't a field study, but this person said that in their mind as they did the staring, they thought about going up and bashing that person over the head with a hammer or doing something very violent. So, we laugh at what you've just said, but actually imagining doing something very harmful to the person produced good effects, that the outcome was really good. So I need to go back to what that was, because a few audience members then said, I think even Anne Winsper, about something around that in terms of how could you enforce that threat without it being obvious, without it being said? How could you increase those risks while it's still remaining ethical? So I do think that is important. One, it having to matter, and two, imposing a threat and risk within the confines of being safe. So, we laugh at that, but it is important.
And there were no gender characteristics. That surprised me, because generally women are said to feel more vulnerable in public spaces.
Well, they got that bias towards a non-staring outcome selection. And again, it's just 200 overall, and they've come from separate samples of 100. The power, even though it's 100, it's not great enough. We need a much larger sample size. We need to be working with stuff that's very comparable to the data sets that Rupert's working with. And hopefully the team that you've seen here named at the start, Ben, Ellie, myself and Matt, can take this forward and actually, over time, collect comparable numbers as well. There we would start to get more meaningful information about what's happening with the genders. Maybe even ask them about their beliefs as well. So we can actually look and see if there's a sheep-goat effect going on as well. So are the believers producing different effects to the skeptics, the goats?
The problem is there are so many potential variables, from personality variables, assuming essentialist views of personality, all the way through to current state of what did they have for breakfast. We just do not know.
No.
So unless you've got a very controlled situation, it's going to be difficult to establish what are the contributing factors. But Smart and Sheldrake are getting consistently positive results, yeah?
Yeah, I'll give you that last question, then you can take it over to the audience. But over time, Pam Smart is Rupert's research assistant, even helped out with the studies of dogs to know when their owners
I remember.
And she collates a lot of all the emails Rupert gets with all these day-to-day experiences. And from what I've seen, the results are promising. And Rupert said this for a long time, that it is an important factor in terms of how people detect whether the stare is actually coming from directional staring. And so that's gone in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and that is open access, I believe. So I do recommend people go and have a look at that. Go on Google Scholar, type in Smart and Sheldrake 2023, staring or scopaesthesia, and you can find these kinds of papers and read them to your leisure.
Thank you so much. And on this note, you'd best get on, and I will go and prepare this for when our guests arrive.